My name is Mary Conquest. I'm your host for Safety Labs, the podcast where we explore the human side of safety to support safety professionals. We move past regulations and reportables to talk about the core skills of safety leadership: empathy, influence, trust, rapport. In other words, the soft skills that help you do the hard stuff. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Hi there. Welcome to Safety Labs. If you're listening to this show, I assume that you agree that safety and organizational success go hand in hand. But as I'm sure you know, not everyone really understands how the two interact. Today's guest operates at the intersection of the ideals of safety and success, and we'll talk about that dynamic, as well as diving further into the technique of debriefing, what it is, how to do it, and how it can contribute to safety. Brandon Williams is a speaker, airline pilot, and human factors professor with over 2 decades of experience leading teams in dynamic, complex, and high-risk environments. A former U.S. Air Force fighter pilot, lieutenant colonel, and safety officer, Brandon brings a unique blend of military precision, safety expertise, and real-world leadership to organizations striving for excellence in high-reliability industries. Brandon equips leaders with the strategies and tools to build HROs and high-performance teams across sectors, including transportation, healthcare, energy, construction, and manufacturing. His keynotes and training sessions are grounded in military aviation principles and safety science, offering actionable insights into system-level thinking, human error mitigation, and decision-making under pressure. And Brandon joins us from Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome.
Thanks, Mary. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on the show.
So, as I said, I think most of our audience understands how safety and organizational success are intertwined. And those intersections are naturally going to come up in our conversation, but not everyone sees the link between safety and success. And I'm curious about what are some misconceptions that you have come across when it comes to that relationship between safety and excellence?
Yeah, well, great question to start out, Mary. And again, like I said, thank you very much for having me here today to have this conversation. So obviously safety, leadership is a big thing with what I do, as you kind of alluded to there in the intro. But yeah, that's a great question, because I think oftentimes when in these industries we talk about safety, it is typically in a program mindset, right? So a safety program or a safety, function, or a safety officer, or the, HSC person, or, whatever that we have to comply with to do these things. Versus, when we look at, the world I come from, for example, aviation, safety is not just, a program or a function or these these tools or these assets or resources we use. Safety is literally intertwined in everything we do. Safety is intertwined in from our planning, our briefing, our execution, and then we're going to talk later about debriefing, as you said. But also just so many things that we do. Whether it's in commercial aviation, the big thing is checklist usage. One thing that extreme checklist discipline that other industries have taken on, brought from commercial aviation. And I bring that up because everything we do in aviation, and we used to say this in the Air Force as well, is that, every process, procedure, thing we do for these safety, it was all written in blood. Which what that means is there's been a serious incident, there's been a mishap, there's been things that have happened in the past, which has driven these actions, driven why we do these things, from, like you said, from debriefing and in how we learn about it, how we make things better. So I think the intersection there, when you think about safety and organizational success, I say that, well, the job of any leader or any owner or any manager or anyone involved in these high risk industries that we're talking about, right? I mean, what should be the number one top of their mind is what? Is safety, safety of their people, safety, reducing mishaps and certainly, no fatalities and damaging the equipment and things like that. So in order to do that, leaders have to understand, human error, have to understand human factors, which is a big thing of what I talk about, not just from a program standpoint, but from a, systems thinking standpoint. And so how we as leaders, build our teams, design our teams, implement things, that's a natural way of how we do business, if you will. And so that really is drive success because just like, I mean, you've talked about this before, I'm sure, but safety success is your organizational success, right? Especially when you're in high risk industries. I mean, yes, any of these businesses we're making money, profit is at the end of the day, the end goal. However, when I always ask this a lot of my talks, I said, what's the number one goal of any leader? What is it? And I always say it's performance improvement. I mean, period, dot. Performance improvement of the organization, performance improvement of your team, of your individuals, because all this goes towards success of the organization. And part of that performance improvement a high majority of it in these high risk industries is safety, right? Is our safety statistics, our safety record, our safety performance, all these things. So I think when you intertwine that, and really understand that and have these processes and leaders that really embrace that, I think that's where organizational success is really tied to safety.
So you framed your ideas about safety into what you've called the 6 pillars of operational excellence. So I kind of like to go through to better understand each of these, if that's okay. So the first one is clear intent, aligning action through purpose, clarity, and commander's intent. So tell us a little more about that.
Yeah. So that last part of that really kind of is where I got that from. Obviously, you talked about my background in the Air Force and the military, and 20 years, 12 years at active duty. Like you said, I was an Air Force fighter pilot flying F-15s and lieutenant colonel, aviation safety officer, several of the leadership positions. But a key component of the military is something we called commander's intent, which is really when we did an operation or any type of, what's going on right now across the world, there is a commander's intent, which is what is the desired end state, right? So when operations cease, what does success look like? And so the idea of that is your people, your tactical leaders can essentially, when they know their commander's intent or the clear intent, they can come up with their own tactical objectives, which is a big part of our planning process as well. Clearly defined objectives, those building blocks to achieving our yearly goal or our quarterly goal or 5-year plan or whatever that is. So that's the first part of it. But the second part, and I think even more importantly to clear intent, is that prioritization. So, when we have a clear intent, when we had a commander's intent, there's always got to be typically and ideally, maybe 3 top priorities that you want your people to think about when they, all the way down to the frontline employee, the frontline leader, the middle level manager leader. 3 overarching kind of priorities you want them to think about, right? When they go and do their job or their task. Because that way, when people are making their autonomous decisions, as you should want your people to do, right? Especially in these high risk industries, we don't have a choice like aviation, then you want them to have kind of that backdrop, right? Those 3 top priorities for the organization. And it's not strategic initiatives. It's just things you want them to think about. Hey, Mary, when you go out and do this, here's our 3 organizational priorities I want you to think about every time, your backdrop when you do something there. So that's what clear intent is. It's alignment, but it also gives your people priorities to kind of make sure, they're staying same way, same day for the organization as well.
So have you encountered organizations that you've worked with where this particular pillar wasn't well developed, like where there were obstacles or they just had trouble implementing it? And if so, like what are common obstacles? Like, no one ever intends to not be excellent, right? But things happen. So yeah.
Absolutely. Well, 2 things there. First of all, yes. I mean, you can usually tell when I work with these teams and organizations and I'm talking to the leader of the organization, whether it, be a VP or maybe even the CEO or some other frontline leader, whatever team I'm working with. And I'll ask them that question. I'll say, what is your, I'll explain clear intent to them. I'll say, what's your priorities for your team? Inevitably, a lot of times they'll just list off kind of one, major overarching kind of, pie in the sky thing, or either they'll list off, well, we got these strategic initiatives, these quarterly goals. I'm like, no, that's great. That's goals. But what's your real, when you're, what are your real priorities, right? For your team members, when they execute, what are the top 3 things you want them to think about? For example, in my job as a major airline pilot, as a captain, my company has given me a lot of responsibility. When that door closes and we push back, I'm in charge. I mean, I have a team, obviously, a lot of people that help me and work with me, but I get 51% of the vote. At the end of the day, I'm going to be responsible for whatever happens on that airplane or to that airplane. But my team, my company has given me, top 3 priorities. Number 1 is safety. Number 2 is passenger comfort. And then number 3 is on-time performance and schedule. So every decision I make, that's the order I go in, right? Yes, we want to be on time. That's what we do as an airline. However, passenger comfort and safety above that come before that. So that's the first things, they trust me to make decisions on. So that's kind of an example, but you can tell usually when, leaders or managers or, someone in charge doesn't have that pretty quickly. And then to your other point, I think that's even more important. I talk about this in my keynotes all the time in workshops. You said, what are the obstacles that stand in the way of that? Because like you said, we all want to do good, but it comes back to human factors, right? So when I was flying that F-15, imagine that cockpit, there's over 200 switches, dials, displays, buttons, everything that's in that airplane. Okay. So an environment the human was never designed to operate in at a very high level. And you're moving, 300, 400 miles per hour, combat or peacetime. You're dealing with weather, doing all kind of things, right? Trying to fly this airplane, all the systems and the bells and beeps and squeaks. And so what I always say, clear intent was critically important there, because what happens in that environment, what do we do as humans? We easily get distracted, right? And in that environment, if you don't know what's the most important, what do? You can tend to lock on or focus on something that's not very important at that, even though you may think in your mind it is. And so that only came to us through good training, but also through, again, leaders, right? Our leaders, my instructors, my flight leads over the years, my mentors who had taught me, hey, Manson, that was my call sign. When you're flying in this environment down low, this is the only two things in the cockpit you need to worry about. Everything else you need to be worried about outside. So you stay, above the ground, right? And in the right part where you need to be. So the biggest thing with that is distractions. We as humans, we're naturally wired to what? Bright, shining object. Here we go. We're going to look over there. It's a survival mechanism. But the problem is in these high reliability industries, those things we get distracted from, are not necessarily the most important things. And oftentimes they're not. So that's the biggest thing that gets in the way of clear intent. So the critical part, again, goes back to, as leaders, your priorities. And guess what? As you go farther down, closer to the frontline employee or frontline leader, those top three priorities you give your people, it's going to be even more tactically focused, right? For the job or for the project or whatever you're doing, versus a high level, you're going to have priorities just kind of trickle down, right? So that's why it's so important that you give a very good, clear intent, establish good priorities for your people. Because again, we're going to get distracted, but that's what always stands in the way is distractions. Why it's so critical that we kind of keep recaging that focus.
Okay. Yeah. And I think listening to you, clarity is really the key there.
Absolutely.
So the next one is situational awareness, enhancing perception and anticipation across teams. So talk a bit about that, and then I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of situation awareness is obviously something in aviation that, you learn about this in the first day of, pilot training or any kind of flight training you do. And it's taken on in a lot of their industries as well. I mean, healthcare talks a lot about this, other transportation industries and other high reliability industries you mentioned earlier that are focused on safety. The word situational awareness has been embraced a lot. And it's often talked about in the self-defense industry, but it's just that, kind of like that, the definition you just gave, right? It's the perception of all those variables around us and how it affects us in our current state. More importantly, how it's going to affect us in the future. So it really, situational awareness, why it's so important in aviation and other industries, it kind of allows you to start to predict what's going to happen next, right? So what's going to happen, where I'm flying an airplane, there's weather ahead, I'm dealing with that. We're talking with air traffic control. We have to have high situational awareness to kind of predict what's going to happen 50, 100 miles ahead. What are we going to do with this weather? Are we going to go around it, above it, low, what's going to happen? Can we do this? And so you're always constantly trying to stay ahead or keep high situational awareness. And the reason this is so important, again, going back to human factors, is because what's a natural, state of humans many times is complacency, right? And so complacency is probably the most contributing factor, if not causal factor, of any mishap in aviation and so many other industries as well. Because again, we as humans, what do we like? We like habit. We like to be comfortable. We want to get to that comfortable state. And so when we do, that's when complacency sets in, right? And that's when we start to get low situational awareness, right? And so maintaining that situational awareness, I always say, starts number one with a very good, briefing before we go execute. we have a plan, but before we walk out the door, let's talk about, what our objectives are, clearly defined objectives. What are our obstacles, what are areas of vulnerability, as I call it, where things could go wrong. Let's discuss that. What are the roles? Everybody's roles kind of established. It's important not only to understand your role, but everyone else's as well. And then finally, kind of what are those what ifs? What have we not thought about? What are some unexpected things we don't really think they're going to happen, but if they do happen, let's talk about that, right? So if I'm flying out there today and a thunderstorm rolls in, not expecting that, but if it does, what's going to be our game plan? Or if we're going to an airport with one runway, airplane lands in front of us, blows a tire, that runway shut down. Now what are we going to do? Where's our closest piece of concrete? Do we have enough gas to get there? And so I think that's where situational awareness starts, is before, I always say, before you even walk out the door, to go and execute, right? And then when you're executing, a technique I always give frontline teams, I always talk about, is something I'll call healthy paranoia. And so I say a little healthy paranoia is good because, again, it's always, I always say, when you're in aviation, we always talk about, when I was an instructor, I'd tell my students, when you're flying along, you think you've got everything wired and everything's going good and you're on top of it. That's when you've missed something. That's when you need to do a quick mental double check of, what have I not thought about, right? And there's a way to do that, obviously good. And that takes practice and techniques. But the idea of situational awareness is so critical, because I always say good situational awareness is the first step in decision making. Having that high situational awareness there. So that's why that's so important, I think.
So I think you mostly answered my question. I wanted to make an observation too, though, that you mentioned complacency. And I think a lot of us, when we hear complacency, we hear like judgment, like we hear laziness, but that's not at all what you're talking about.
Not at all. Again, it's a natural human factor. That's why I talk about human factor. I mean, and that's a great point, I think, into my whole concept of this human factor, why I call it human factors leadership. Exactly what you just mentioned is, I always say, no professional shows up to work saying, I'm going to make a mistake today. I'm going to make a bad decision. I'm going to cause a mishap. I'm going to do something that's going to result in something bad happening today. I mean, nobody does that in a professional setting, right? None of your listeners working with their teams and company, nobody does that. It's always human factors at play. Even if a human factor may not necessarily be the root cause, and oftentimes it is, it's always going to be a contributing factor. It's always going to be, whether it's complacency, it's fatigue, mental, physical, it's poor communication, poor situational awareness, task overload, lack of knowledge, you name it. I mean, there's so many different human factors. And like you just said, complacency, like I said, it's a natural human condition, human state we strive towards, right? We want to be comfortable. And so when we think we've got everything wired, what does our mind do? I can relax a little bit, right? And so it's not that you can never relax or you have to always be on edge. It's just understanding, right? That it's like they say about pilots. You always ask, what's the most dangerous pilot? Is it the brand new pilot that has maybe, 50 hours? Is it the mid-range pilot maybe has around 500 hours? Or is it the more experienced pilot that has thousands of hours? And I always say it's going to be that thousands of hours pilot, most likely, because why? They've been doing it so long, especially if they had nothing ever happen. And that's where you get complacent, right? The new pilot, they don't know what they don't know, but they're going to be very, cautious. The 500-hour pilot is at their peak, right? Because they know a lot now, but they're still very, aware and very, building their toolbox still, if you will. So, but that's a good way to define complacency, I think, or kind of explain that.
Okay, so the next one is decision making. So leading under pressure with agility, clarity, and confidence. So easy to read, and I think very hard for people to do.
Yeah, and with decision making, these two really tie into the situational awareness discussion. I usually, when I talk about these go hand in hand. Like I said, situational awareness is the first step in decision making. And so when I talk about decision making, there's kind of three components there, right? When we debrief, I would use this. I always tell people to frame it from these three components. When you look at a negative action, whether it was somebody's decision, or somebody's action or whatever, always look at it from what I call perception, decision, execution. Perception, decision, execution. Because typically we just look at execution or decision. Execution is the actual, skill set, knowledge. Do they actually know how to do this task, right? If they've never been trained, well then, okay, there's the root cause. But if you talk about decision, that they know how to do it, they know how to go and work on this piece of equipment or fix this piece of machinery, or they've done this before. Let's look at their decision. Why did they skip a step? Or, why did they do the wrong procedure? Let's look at that. So what was the decision-making process? Well, if their decision was good and they went down a path that they thought was right, they didn't skip a step intentionally, they were doing the right thing, then we want to look at perception, right? Well, what was their perception? And that's where situational awareness comes in, right? That's where they didn't understand the job. They didn't understand the task. They didn't understand what they were expected to do. They missed, they missed a variable that they should have caught before they started doing this. They didn't have they didn't brief before they went in, so they didn't know if something went wrong, what they were going to do. So that goes back to perception and situational awareness. So that's when I talk about decision making, is what I really talk about is situational awareness is kind of that first step, and it sets you up for that good decision making, right? Because if you have high situational awareness, hopefully, or you should have, better decisions. The other thing, when you're talking about under pressure, real time stuff, something's going wrong, uh, fires are everywhere, figuratively or not figuratively, whatever. If when everything's, coming crashing down, everything's going wrong and you got to make a decision quick. I always talk about, we talk about in aviation. When you have an aircraft emergency, what happens? Your adrenaline starts going. Again, human factors. What do? We go into tunnel vision, survival instinct, and we kind of just focus on one thing that we may think is the most important. Again, going back to that, what I talked about earlier. So what I always say to kind of slow that body response down, I always say, we used to say hack the clock or wind the clock. And this comes from in older airplanes. We used to have these literal, old analog clocks in the airplane. You could wind them in time, and we had to use it for certain functions. But the first step in any emergency we trained to was always, we'd say hack the clock or wind the clock. And basically double hack the clock, it goes to zero. And there's some emergencies where time is important. You need to know how much time you have left or something like that with electrical issues or other things. But the real reason we did that was to kind of go slow yourself down. So when you see that clock go to zero, you kind of reset your mind. It kind of, okay, hack the clock, take a breath and assess, just assess what you have before you start just pushing buttons and, and going through situations. Because that's when we make things worse, right? When we think we have to take action right away, we get that tunnel vision and we start going down the wrong path. So that's when it comes to decision making under pressure. That's what the technique I always give or talk a lot about, is that kind of hack the clock, wind the clock there, and then, then assess what you have and then make a decision.
I think I've heard of that as engage your frontal cortex, because your limbic system, your reptile brain is freaking out.
A reptilian part of your brain is going up, and it senses a threat. And so what does it do? It just wants to focus on what it thinks is the most important. But the problem is, in the world we operate in, we're not getting chased by a tiger or whatever. So we're, it doesn't know that there's other things at play here, right?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one, which is actually one that we've talked on the show about quite a lot, and that's mutual support. So driving peer accountability, and we've talked a lot about psychological safety specifically. So maybe can you focus a bit more on peer accountability, how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, this all comes from my time as a fighter pilot. And I always talk about when we would always take off and fly, peacetime or combat, we never flew alone, right? We always flew with a wingman. We always flew with what we called mutual support. And it wasn't just, something we kind of did sometimes. It's how we always operated. We never, if you ever took off single ship by yourself, it felt really odd because we just never did that. We always flew in a formation. Sometimes another jet, sometimes we'd have 4 in a formation, depending on what kind of mission we were doing or, we were training for or whatever. But we always went out with mutual support. And the idea of that is kind of like you said, it's kind of that, what I call it, it is that peer accountability piece that's built in. And it's not the kind of pure accountability where, I'm calling you out, Mary, or, I'm going to point out something you're doing wrong just to do it. It's how we train, right? It's how we operate it. So if I'm the flight lead, and by the way, when that canopy comes down or that debrief room door closes in the military, obviously we all have rank, that rank comes off, right? There is no rank in the jet. There's no rank in the debrief room. We made it very clear about that because in those environments, you have to be able to speak up. You have to be able to speak up when you see someone maybe going down a path that's, number one, unsafe, obviously, or if there's a better way to do something, or if you see something. And so that's why we developed this culture of mutual support in everything we did. And it was not, and again, it wasn't just a, hey, you're doing this wrong. If we saw something, we're going to speak up, whether it's on the radio, whether it's in the brief, whether it's when we're in the planning phase. We had to be able to point out when we saw something going on, or when we saw something, happening. And so that's where all this really comes from. And and it starts, it's not just something, there's some organizations that have better, kind of mutual supportive cultures than others. But I always say it's not something you kind of just can do overnight. It starts with, like most things, it starts with leadership, but it starts with really kind of that trust, that mutual support, holding each other accountable, right? And really leaders holding themselves accountable. So I always say, and this goes back into the debrief conversation we're talking about later, but as the leader, if you want your people to hold each other accountable, that mutual support, you've got to open up yourself, right? You've got to open up kind of that shared accountability. So when you've made maybe a questionable decision, or you've made a misstep, or you could have done something better, number one, admit it. Or if people bring it up to you, accept that. That's the biggest thing you can do, because if you want them to provide mutual support, you have to do it for yourself. As well, as a leader, is showing that care and concern for your people as a person, right? So the simple things, the little things that we talk about that makes us human, right? So, if I'm talking to you and we're getting some coffee or something, Mary, and I just say, hey, how are things going? Or, or maybe I knew that you had a parent that was sick, or a child that was sick, or something like that. And I say, hey, how's your mom doing? Or how's your, kind of that. And what does that do is it takes us from, it kind of starts to intertwine that tribal kind of connection, right? Where we kind of feel as one team, that relationship connection. Because that's really where mutual support, that's why it worked so well for us, because we had such a high level of camaraderie in those military organizations I was in. I mean, the people we worked with, or the people we hung out with after work, we knew each other. We knew probably, a lot about our families, and hung out after, outside the workplace. And so when I provided that mutual support, when I was helping you out, it wasn't just, I wanted, I just did it because of my job. I truly wanted you to do a good job. I wanted you to succeed. I wanted you to look good. I wanted the team to look good. And so that's just how we operated. Matter of fact, I'll tell you this, we even instilled it from, just when we went through Air Force pilot training as students. So when I was a instructor in Air Force pilot training, a flight commander, you were graded obviously every day on every ride you did. You had a grade sheet, and you were ranked graded every day. And so when you finished pilot training with your class of, I don't know, 20 or 25, however many students it was, you were rank ordered, right? 1 through 20, let's say. And that rank order, yes, your daily flying scores and your check ride scores, that was a big part of it. But we also had something called a commander ranking, flight commander ranking, which was really a very subjective ranking of where myself and other instructors ranked our students. There was no number assigned to it. And that was purely based on how well they supported their classmates, how well they, provided info to them, how well they shared info that they were taught. Because we used to always say we didn't have enough resources to teach all of you everything. You have to share this info amongst each other. It kind of embedded that mutual support mindset, because we knew that's the world they were going to, right? Flying fighters, they're going to have to be able to do that. And so I think that mutual support concept is really so important, because it's really about, in these higher reliability industries we talk about, when you have autonomous people making decisions, you have to have people, that can speak up. You have to have that culture where everyone feels like they can speak up. And in my talks, I'll give a lot of examples, because a lot of times that's hard, right? It's hard to we don't want to be the bad person, or we don't want to be the, fun police, or we don't want to be the, I don't want to feel like I'm calling you out to make myself look better. And I said, it's not that. And I'll even give some examples of what I call mutual support, calm things, like hey, confirm you want this. Hey, I know you said this, and maybe I'm missing something, but what about this? And it's not that's better than saying, Mary, I think you're wrong. We need to do it this way. So there's better ways you can do things. And I talk about that in my talks and workshops, giving people, hey, here's some examples of good, kind of ways to start that mutual supportive calm. But it's so critical. It literally is the lifeblood, I think, of high performing, high reliability teams. Because if you don't have that peer level accountability, then I think, you're missing out, and things are going to get through, right? Gaps are going to open up for sure.
Yeah, it seems to me like the military, it's so hierarchical by nature, right? That's the way it's organized. And so it's very powerful to say, in this context, in this room, at this time, there is no rank, right? Like
Right.
that's
Absolutely.
very
I mean,
powerful in
that's
such,
it
yeah.
is. It's one of the I mean, everybody laughs, we have call signs. Like I said, my call sign was Manson, but one of that part of that tradition goes back to, and long story there, but part of that tradition, yes, and we usually do something stupid to get that name, which again goes back to humility and mutual support and be able to critique yourself. But part of that tradition is kind of that reason is, having those call signs, it kind of takes that rank away, right? When you have, we're all in these, yes, it's funny how we get these names sometimes, but it serves a purpose as well, that you have this call sign, because it's kind of taking the rank off a little bit, right? And when you go out and execute it, it's very defined. When I was a flight lead leading a formation, there's many times when I was not the most senior ranking officer in that formation, that flight. However, I had the 51% vote on everything we did. I was responsible for that formation, no matter what everybody's rank was, because I was the assigned flight leader. I was the assigned instructor that day. And so we had a in aviation, just because it was of the nature of it, in just like a high reliability industry, you had to be able to take off that rank. The canopy closes, rank comes off. When that debrief or briefing room door closes, rank comes off. Then when we walk out, we go back to our normal jobs. Then it's back to, kind of that rank structure. And that is for obviously the profession of arms has to have a rank structure. It's a very important thing. But at a tactical level, when you're operating like that, you've got to be able to have the experts. I call it flattening the hierarchy. The experts, they have the most knowledge, being able to run that or being able to inject something there.
Okay, I want to get to all of them, so I'm going to
Sure,
move to the
yeah.
next, which is just culture, and we actually talk about this quite a lot, and that's reframing accountability. So blame and train, switching, or like moving towards learn and grow. So I'll let you explain that further.
Yeah, you just said it right there. I mean, it's and just culture ties into debrief culture as well. I kind of use those intertwined a little bit, but the just culture is the basis behind it. And my aviation safety background from the Air Force, where I was an aviation safety officer. I was qualified to investigate mishaps, and I ran safety programs. I've taught aviation safety at several universities around the country currently now, at several schools. But it's just culture. I always say just culture was kind of psychological safety before psychological safety was even kind of coined. I mean, we kind of embraced that idea in the safety world, the aviation safety world, at least a long time ago, especially the commercial aviation world. And it's really this idea of this non-retributional environment where you identify safety hazards, or you admit to, like I said, it's the idea that no one shows up to work intending to make a mistake or intending to have a bad day. And so it's a very non-retributional environment of, hey, I saw this today. We did this wrong. Here's why. Here's some changes, lessons we learned, right? Kind of that debrief culture mindset. And the idea now, you can't, I always say it's not a get out of jail free card for complete willful disregard for rules or negligence or anything like that, right? There's a clear, fine line there. And the healthcare world has actually done a pretty good job too. They've taken a lot of things from commercial aviation, but they've started to do a really good job. Matter of fact, I worked with one, and I thought they had a really good chart that they use. They showed it to me when they have an accident or a mishap, or something that happens. Maybe they applied the wrong medication to a patient or something like that. And when they go in and investigate it or debrief it, they kind of look at it on this chart. And on one end is the kind of what I just said. It's the kind of willful, I would almost say criminal negligence, right? Which is almost always not the case, right? But that's the far extreme end. And on the other end, you have the obviously was trying to do a good job, wanted to do this, but there's human factors at play, and they missed it because they were fatigued, they were complacent, there were gaps in the system that we set them up for failure. Basically, they didn't get all the info they needed, or there was poor communication, or things like that. So you kind of look at that, and that just culture mindset is almost always here, right? Where someone was intending to do a good job, but they didn't because they were, again, mentally, physical fatigue, poor communication, poor situation awareness. And why is that? But the idea of a just culture, the real reason of that is because you want people to report when they see something. You want people to speak up when something goes wrong, or when they see something they could have done better, if that makes sense. And that's the key with just culture.
I'm going to get to the last pillar, which is debrief culture. But first, let's hear a little bit about the company behind the podcast, and that's Safety Products Global. With the biggest range of safety knives on the market, Safety Products Global owns the Slice, Clever, and Pacific Handy Cutter brands. We've all had experience of cutting something and it didn't go quite as planned. In manufacturing and construction, this happens all the time, and it's a big laceration risk. Solution is something like the Pacific Handy Cutter Smart Retract Victa. So this is a heavy-duty knife. It's got the same, show you the blade here, it's got the same cutting depth and power as a standard knife. It can handle triple-walled corrugate, but it also has built-in intelligence. And what that means is smart blade retraction. When you're cutting something, if you lose contact, if the blade loses contact with what you're cutting, it will automatically retract even if you're still squeezing the trigger. So imagine you're cutting something and you slip. Instead of also cutting your torso or your leg, the blade will have retracted. The squeeze trigger is also glove friendly and it's ergonomic, which helps to reduce hand fatigue. And tool-free blade change is very easy. There's a button here, keeps downtime to a minimum. So if you want to learn more about which tools will work for you for your materials, and to request free samples, you can go to safetylabspodcast.com/samples. And now back to our show. Okay, so we're going to talk about debriefing. So it's the principle here is debrief to improve, embedding a culture of accountability and learning.
So yeah, I mean, and I think debriefing, is probably the thing I talk about the most when I talk about my methodology, my process, because all these things we just talked about really do feed into that. You got to have mutual support culture where people can speak up because that's going to come out in the debrief, right? You got to have, we're going to assess our situational awareness, right? You got to have a clear intent, which goes down to clearly defined objectives. And many times that's a root cause when you debrief is we didn't have those. You got to have something to debrief is my point. What was our objective? Did we achieve that? And why not? That's where we get into that. But, a debrief culture, and I call it a debrief culture because, when I talk about debriefing, again, this goes back to the fighter pilot debrief. Like I always say people always ask, as a fighter pilot, how do you operate at such a high level? You fly those speeds and those different environments, pulling up to, 8 or 9 Gs and doing all this stuff. And how do you do that? And I always say, well, there's nothing, there's nothing special about me or anybody else I ever flew with in terms of a human being, right? I mean, so it was always, when I look back on it, how we learn. I talked earlier about, how did we learn how to focus, right? How do we know what was important? Well, all this goes back to debriefing. After every single mission we flew, training, combat, it didn't matter. We would come back, we would get in a room, shut the door. Like I said, rank comes off and we would debrief. What happened? Why did it happen? And more importantly, what are the lessons learned? What are we going to implement next time? What did we learn individually, number one? But also, is there anything for the organization we need to take back? Our organizational practices, standards, processes, any gaps in the system. Because going back to human factors, part of the debrief is pulling out, what human factors were at play. Because there's always going to be those human factors that were there that cause the distractions or the complacency or the poor communication or our task overload or our, where did the human error seep in and why did that happen? So we got to talk about that because ideally as a leader in a safety environment, what do you want? What's your job really is mitigating human error is really designed, like I said earlier, designing teams and systems to kind of close those gaps, right? Kind of those gaps in the system or those catches in the system is going to hopefully catch those traps, those human errors. And so debriefing is all about that. It's purely all it is about performance improvement. It's not again, going from that blame and train to that learn and growth mentality. Because what I always argue is a debrief, we intertwine these two terms a lot, but they are different. A debrief is not an investigation because what is an investigation?
I was just going to ask about that. Yeah, please.
And I intertwine them too sometimes because there are certain aspects, but what does an investigation try to do? An investigation tries to find blame, right? An investigation wants to find blame. Investigation is trying to pin it on someone or something, right? Whereas a debrief's goal is purely improvement. It's purely just, why did this happen? Mary, you may have made some mistakes. Okay. But we're trying to see why you did that. Because again, you didn't show up just intending to do this. So why did Mary show up today and forget to do this or not do this process right or not do this step right? Maybe she, again, like we talked about in the healthcare example earlier, maybe there was poor communication. Maybe she was not given a piece of info. Maybe she didn't have a clear objective. Maybe there's not clear intent. Maybe she was given too much, or maybe she was given something she wasn't really trained for. Or maybe there's a lot of mental and physical fatigue going on here and the ops tempo is too high or whatever. We're trying to find out why you did that. And, a lot of the debrief, the meat of it is that root cause analysis part, right? And that's really where I teach. I do a lot of teaching in that area is how do we really do root cause analysis? How do we, there's the technique of the 5 whys, ask why 5 times, and then usually when you get to the 5th one, that's probably where it went off the tracks. But oftentimes where we mistake this or we don't do this well is we'll say, oh, well, Mary, or Brandon did this. Well, Brandon, you didn't do that right. We need to train you up. Well, stop, let's talk about this. Well, Brandon didn't just show up and intend to do this. Let's ask him why. What were you thinking? What were you looking at? What was your perception? Again, that perception, decision, execution model, right? Did you understand what you were doing? Did you have the proper tools? What was communicated to you? Things like that. You want to understand why that happened because you may very well know how to do that job very well. It's just there are bigger root causes, bigger human factors there that we have to understand. And so that's the mindset of the debrief. But the end state of it, the whole purpose of it is purely to pull out lessons learned. That's all. It's not, like I said, it's not an individual evaluation. It's not for leaders to come in and evaluate their people. It's not for, I always say the debrief is kind of like Vegas. What happens in the debrief stays in the debrief because all we need to know is the lessons learned. That's all we really need to know outside of that, right? Now, people ask me, well, what if you have a continuing bad performer? Well, that's a different conversation, right? And that's where leadership comes in. Of course, if you have someone that continuously is, not meeting the job or not doing something right, well, maybe they need more training. Maybe they need, some other kind of expectations. Maybe they're in the wrong role. I mean, who knows? But that is a different conversation. That's for outside the debrief. Because the debrief, we're just purely looking at our actions and why these actions happened, right? From a systems thinking kind of standpoint. But that's really, and I say debrief culture because I say a debrief doesn't have to be you go in a room, shut the door, and talk for an hour or 2 hours. Now, for bigger tasks and projects and things like that, it probably does. But a debrief culture implies, we can debrief, and I do this in my healthcare teams all the time and frontline, like construction teams and things like that. I'm like, a debrief can be 5 minutes. Let's just talk about this real quick. Maybe just me and you, Mary, did this one task. I mean, it went okay, it went fine, but let's talk about it. Is there anything better we could have done? Why did we, or maybe it took us a little longer. Let's talk about that. Just go through that quick, 5-minute step, or 5 minutes and just take a few minutes and talk about it. Because a debrief culture is this idea is we're all consistently trying to get better. We're always trying to improve. And so we're always doing this debrief mindset. Again, you got to, a big part of it is setting that tone, the rank comes out of it. So how do we talk about this, just me and you as peers? And so that's what a debrief culture really is. But I always say that for any of this stuff to happen, you've got to have a solid debrief culture. That's, if you do anything, that's the one thing that I think teams can embrace, or I know teams can embrace and really drive better performance. I mean, from safety, which performance is obviously key, or any organization where you're looking to get better. It's so critical. But again, you've got to have that mutual support culture. You got to have leaders that hold themselves accountable. You got to have leaders that participate in these debriefs, which the first part of that, there's a critical way you set that tone as a leader in a debrief. But yeah, that's the biggest piece of what I talk about with team. Matter of fact, one of my offerings is a debrief workshop where we actually kind of go really in depth in that. They have the option to debrief some things they've done in the past. And I kind of show them, how we do some of these steps, kind of 4 steps to that debrief model there.
Yeah, I was going to say another difference is that often investigations happen. First of all, the scale is different often. An investigation will happen after something. Usually it's quite catastrophic before there's a big investigation or inquiry. But it sounds like debriefing happens regardless of how well things went.
That is, I'm so glad you brought that up because that is one of the biggest misconceptions about debriefing is most teams think, oh, well, everything went fine. We even do this in aviation a lot of times still. Oh, well, I work with a lot of big flight schools and I work with their young flight instructors. And I take this military fighter pilot debrief model to that world because a lot of times in that world, in these flight schools, they're high ops tempo. They're just going from one flight to the next, and they're flying with brand new students. And they're like, oh, we debriefed in the airplane, or oh, we debriefed walking back from the airplane. I'm like, well, think about this. How well do you debrief when you're in the airplane, you're a student, you're sweating, you're trying to, there is stuff they can show you, but the real learning happens, I always say, when you're at 0 feet, 0 knot, 1G, sitting in a room where you've had something to drink, and now you can really embrace all that learning, right? And so the debrief, though, you're 100%, like I said earlier, every mission I did in the military and the Air Force, training or combat, we always debriefed. And I always ask people, how many of those missions you think were successful? A very, very high percentage, right? I mean, we achieved our objectives. We essentially did what we went to go do, but we always debriefed. And we always found ways we could have done things better. We always found, some better ways we could have executed, better decisions we could have made, better things we could have called in the planning. We find near misses. That's a big thing with safety teams and debriefs, though, is finding near misses. Because a lot of times we're like, oh, everything went well, great. Let's go to the next task. And maybe somebody else has something they saw, but that never gets out because we didn't debrief, right? And so you have to, debriefing is something you're exactly right, is we do always. That's why I call it a debrief culture as well, because we don't just do it when something goes wrong. Matter of fact, I think it's sometimes even more important when we have a big win to debrief, because why? You want to understand why it went really well, right? What are some best practices we can pull out of this? But again, with that, I think the key to the debrief is you've got to have a solid structure, a solid process to it, because that's kind of what I give is this simple, scalable process. Because without that, we're kind of just having a discussion, and we have kind of that what I call artificial harmony, where everybody just kind of, hey, you got anything? No, I think it went okay. What about you? No, everything went good. Okay, see ya. Instead of this, let's go through this, kind of, step-by-step process real quick to make sure, because you add structure to it, right? We add structure to something, then it tends to go a little better, especially if it's kind of hard for us to do. So, but that's such a critical point you brought up. You're absolutely right.
So one of the, I'll ask about the structure in a minute of things that are and are not a debrief. But one of the things is you talk about respectful truth and a tone of accountability. So I think even as you said, if you're walking and it's really quick and everyone just wants to get somewhere, then the tone that is set is not one where people can learn. If people are still nervous, if adrenaline is still flowing, they're not going to be learning. But if they're sitting down, there's a structure environment. How does a leader sort of set that respectful truth tone?
Right. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, but just like in a mutual support culture, if you as a leader want to have that with your team, you have to show your own accountability. You have to hold yourself accountable. You have to open your own self, be vulnerable yourself to things you could have done wrong or could have done better. And so the best way, one of the best techniques I think that I've seen, I used to do this as an instructor in the Air Force when I would debrief or a flight lead. But the best way I see it is before you even start that debrief, you shut the door, we start talking, or not even shut the door. We're going to sit down and talk real quick about this, a debrief. The very first thing you do as a leader is some things you could have done better today, right? Hey, here's some things I think for the team. I right off the bat, I'm going to tell you some things I think I could have done better. I could have, provided these tools for you better today, or maybe I could have made a better decision here, or maybe I could have, changed this or whatever. For example, when I was an instructor flying T-38s, a supersonic jet trainer, which it's what we Air Force uses to teach our future fighter pilots. One of the things I'd always, like I said, I would always come back with that student, brand new student, right? They just have a few hours, few hundred hours, maybe barely 100 hours. And I have thousands of hours, right? And I'm teaching them. So we come back to debrief. And the very first thing I do, I try to find something I could have done better for them as an instructor or even as a pilot. If I did something where I could have done better, I demoed this maneuver to you. Here's some things I didn't do well on that. Here's some things I could have done better. Or as an instructor, I say, Mary, I know your landings were a little long today. And so I think I noticed your power pull was late. Well, one thing I didn't talk to you in the brief about, I didn't really talk to you about when you want to pull your power. So I think if I'd have gave you that instruction, your landings would have been better today. So I'll take some of the blame on that for me. So when I do that, what have I done just now? Kind of start to take down a little bit of those barriers to communication, that reptilian part of the brain we talk about. Suddenly it's not so defensive because a debrief, again, why are they so hard? Because it's not natural for us to talk about our missteps in front of our peers, right? And so we sense it as a threat, a defense. And so it kind of starts to bring down those defensive barriers. So we feel like we can speak up. And that's what I call that tone of accountability environment. Because if you don't, that's why that's the first step. Because if you don't do that in a debrief and you don't get that where people feel like they can speak up and even speak out, and point out things that other team members did, then you might as well not even debrief, because we're just having a discussion of, like I said, that artificial harmony. We're not really getting out the truth data, as I call it, to get better. And I think, the best example I have is I use this video sometimes in my talks. Is there's one of the Blue Angels documentaries. They show how they kind of start their debrief, and they go around, and that's exactly what they do. They call it a safety, and they fess up right away. Here's some things I have for me. And they just kind of go all the way up to that leader of that organization. They call the boss, the leader of the team. They all fess up to something they could have done better. And that's before they even get into the actual, execution analysis of their show. They just talk right off the bat. Here's some things I could have done better today. But I think that's just so powerful when you lead a debrief, whatever rank you are, position or role or title, it doesn't matter, to start that debrief out right away, just some things you could have done better. Because again, that kind of just, if people are like, well, if you can, talk about you're the leader of this team or manager and you can speak up, then surely I can, admit some of my shortcomings as well. So I think that's so powerful.
Okay, so we obviously don't have time to do the depth of a workshop, but what are some structural elements that you think are key for a good debrief?
Absolutely. So my model, I kind of just told you the first step, right, which is set that tone of accountability, S, and it's kind of a 4-step, right? It's SEAL, SEAL, set the tone of accountability, set the tone. Next is execution, E. And when I say execution, what I mean there is, number one, what was our clearly defined objectives? And if we didn't have a clearly defined objective or objectives, then that's part of the problem, right? So what were our objectives? Did we achieve them? What was the truth data? And what I mean by when I say truth data, as fighter pilots, when we would go back and debrief, we would have all these all kind of info we could have. We had tapes in the airplane that recorded what we did. We had lines that we carried pods that record our track so we could put it on the board and see exactly everything you did, right? Everything that happened, all the airspeeds, altitudes, what I call the truth data. And we did that. That was the first step because we wanted to know what exactly was the truth data. And I give that to teams because I say, before you start, pointing fingers, before you start asking why something happened, make sure everyone's on the same page of exactly what did happen. Because that's critically important, right? Make sure we know what happened. Make sure we know the actual truth results. Because a lot of times, I'm sure people that are listening here have been in these meetings before where you're talking, where you call it a postmortem, or you're talking about something that happened and somebody's saying, that's not really what happened, or I think we're going down the wrong path here. So you don't want to have any assumptions, or if you do have assumptions, you want to make sure they're validated. So that's why it's a critical important step, is what were our objectives and what was the actual truth data. And then from that, I say, if you have a lot of things you want to debrief, I say, what are your debrief focus points, DFP? And this comes up when you have a lot of things you could talk about, but you really want to narrow it down to what are the 2 or 3 biggest gaps that we need to talk about, right? What are the 2 or 3? Hey, we doing this maintenance procedure, and there's a lot of things we could have talked about, but this one step where let's say something fell off, a crane fell off because we didn't have a pin installed. That's going to be one of our DFPs, at debrief focus points. Let's talk about that. Let's dig into that one. But you pull out your DB, that kind of guides your focus, right, for your debrief, for your analyzing. And that word goes into A, which is the A part of SEAL analysis. And this is where we really do the root cause analysis. This is where we do what I was talking about earlier about perception, decision, execution, where we're really analyze. We want to ask each other, hey, what were you looking at? Did you understand what we were doing? What gaps did you see? What human factors were at play? This is another big part. You really want to pull out those, what I call contributing human factors. Okay. So what were some human factors we had there? And we put all that together. And after we analyze, we discuss, then we want to come up with L, which is the lessons learned. What are we taking away from this? At the end of the day, this is, like I said, this is the whole point of the debrief. What did we actually learn here? Individually, what did we learn? Is there anything for the organization or the team or the company as a whole we want to take back, right? Are there any best practices or any things you think we need to recommend our leadership we need to change? This is where we kind of summarize that. And then I always say everyone wants to finish with something they could have done better, something they did well, the team did well, and then what we're going to commit to, doing next. Now, That's a lot of stuff there, I know, but again, it's very flexible. It's very scalable. It's something you can do in a matter of minutes if you have to, with just one or two team members or a small team, or it's something you can really dig into for an hour or two for a very large project task or a quarterly goal or a strategic initiative or something like that. It's very scalable and flexible, but the key of it is that it gives you kind of a structure to follow, and it really it helps you. The very first step is setting that tone, because if you don't do that, then it's just a discussion. You might as well forget about, getting really that truth data out. So that's kind of the summary of it, if you will.
So now zooming out a little bit and looking at all that we've discussed, if you had to boil down today's topic or today's discussion into one actionable step that you recommend to the safety professionals listening, and I realize this is not an easy question, but what would that be?
Boil it down to one. Well, I'll call it human factors. I know that's two words, but
no, it doesn't have to be one word, just like one step.
Well, we'll see human factors leadership, and that's everything I do. That's why I call it human factors leadership. It really is. All this stuff comes back to, safety leadership, or anyone looking in those high reliability industries, high performing teams, because everything I've talked about here today, everything I've built this model, this process on, is all based on this idea of human factors. The idea that, because it's from my safety background, and I learned about human factors, right? Because safety and aviation safety, that's really what it is all about, is human factors. Why did this human, this pilot or this mechanic or this person make this decision? Why did they do that? What were the variables affecting them? And so that's what it really boils down to, is everything I've kind of talked about kind of embraces that concept. And leaders, I say, have to understand that they're, and like we started out earlier, is, when their people show up, no one's showing up intending to make a mistake today. No one's showing up intending to skip steps or cut corners or anything like that. So we're all trying to do our best job. And so we have to understand there are human factors at play. And everything we do, from, clear intent to the debrief, that's all with an underlying basis of human factors there. And how do we, mitigate human error? How do we embrace human factors? And how do we understand that to drive better performance, I think.
Okay. And how can our listeners learn more about the topics in our discussion? Are there any resources out there that you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think about that. External resources specifically, nothing specific that comes to mind. But what I always say is there are so many tools out there, right? I mean, now with AI especially, there are so many things out there to assist you with a lot of this. For example, debriefing, right? There are so many, whether you can call it dashboards. Well, dashboards are really for situational awareness. I mean, we talk about situational awareness. There are so many tools out there, right, that I know I've worked with companies. They have dashboards and certain things they can do to maintain that situational awareness, as I call it. So how do you do that? With a debrief now, I'm experimenting a lot with AI right now and working with that in terms of, how can you use AI to better analyze performance, right? So how can you use AI to put in, hey, here was our objectives, here was our results, here's some ideas we have on here's some other factors around this. What do you think of this assessment? Or what do you, kind of help it with, you kind of help analyze some of that, right? Is kind of another resource. Again, I'm definitely not saying you should use AI to debrief by any means. I mean, it has to have that human component and that's another component, by the way, that's another important point of the debrief, is who should be in the debrief. Only the people that executed, only the people that were there, because they were part of it, right? Only the people that were part of that team. But there's so many, I mean, that's the first thing that comes to mind, I think, is there's so many tools out there that you can use to debrief. I know, for example, like in working a lot at these flight schools, there's several tools out there now that people are developing, apps and things like that, where you can download your, they call it ForeFlight. It's very common in general aviation. And you base how you plan. It's everything you do, your flight plan, everything's on this ForeFlight. You get all your weather, everything, put them on iPads or your phone. They go fly. It records all the info. So it brings back that truth data, I call it, right? And so you have that truth data, you have everything on there. And then from that, you can assess, where do we want to debrief, right? Or tools that give you areas. When you I help teams do this, building what I call debrief guides that are customized to those teams. So, and you have those posted in common areas. I talked about my structure and methodology. I've helped teams kind of customize that to their team. So what are some common human factors we have, and Where do you want to make sure you look in this area for human factors and things like that? So I think that's the best thing that comes to mind when you talk about external resources out there. Again, nothing by name specifically that really comes to mind, but I mean, there's just a lot out there that can help you with that as well, though.
Okay. And where can our listeners find you on the web?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. BrandonWilliamsSpeaker.com is my website. So if you go there, you'll get, there's a lot that we talked about here. Some of that info is out there, and, kind of what I talk about, what I do, more about my background and what I do is there. Keynotes, workshops, and then coaching, consulting as well. Doing a lot of this stuff there, working across different teams. And then on LinkedIn, Brandon Williams Speaker. That's the one social media I'm probably most engaged in is LinkedIn, Brandon Williams Speaker. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook, Leadership Speaker Pilot, if you're interested as well. And then they can always reach out to me with Brandon@BrandonWilliamsSpeaker.com. And I'm happy to provide any resources, any of the stuff we talked about. Like I said, I got a free debrief guide I hand out to teams that kind of encompasses that model I was talking about and gives you a little more into it. You can customize your team. So yeah.
Well, sounds good. Yeah. And we'll provide links in the description of the show. So thank you, Brandon, for your time.
Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you so much for having me on. I really do appreciate it. And I hope that your listeners get something out of this, but I appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
And thanks to our listeners. Please find us on LinkedIn to discuss the ideas in this and other episodes of Safety Lab. And I would like to give a shout out to the Safety Labs team for all their production, logistics, and writing work, and for just being wonderful people. Okay, bye for now. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Until next time, stay safe.